on Ukraine using American weapons to strike military targets in Russia, for example. What's your analysis of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what the politics is behind that, and I wouldn't wish to second guess. President Biden faces all sorts of pressures in Washington that unless you're inside the administration, it's hard to know what those are. All I can tell you is from a military perspective and from a strategic perspective, it seems peculiar. We're well over 2 years into this war. We know from experience that Putin's threats are tending not to manifest themselves. Where NATO and NATO nations show resolve, Putin he might use words, but he backs off. So the US administration's kind of stated concern that using these weapons to strike into Russia might somehow lead to escalation and NATO being drawn into the conflict. I'm afraid I just don't buy that. The evidence says otherwise. Now, none of us have got a crystal ball. That might be the case, but the evidence would suggest it's not. And so I think it's a very peculiar decision to stick with this.
Weeks, Russia has made some of its most significant gains since invading in 2022. And this week, France and Germany both announced Ukraine is allowed to use supplied weapons to strike inside Russia. This is a break with where the U.S. stands, and Canada appears to side with its European allies.
We need to be forward-leaning on this question. Why? Because Russia has no red line. And so that is why we need to make sure that when it comes Ukraine's defense, that we're there to help them, and that we show that notwithstanding what is happening, that we're by their side. And there's, in Canada, no condition on end-user shipment of arms to Ukraine, and that is why we will continue to work with Ukrainian armed forces.
Retired General Tom Lawson is a former chief of the defense staff for the Canadian Armed Forces, and he joins me now. General Lawson, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, David.
You just heard Melanie Joly's response there to a reporter asking about whether Canada is on board with France and Germany in allowing weapons it supplies to Ukraine to hit military sites inside Russia. Certainly, what Canada was able to give is not enough to tip the balance of this conflict. But what message do you think this all sends to other members of NATO, in particular the U.S.?
Right. Well, I think what it's saying is that there is an increasing concern in NATO and elsewhere that Russian momentum threatens to overcome Ukraine defenses, and it's not beyond the pale to think that there's a possibility that Ukraine could fall. Whereas NATO members have all been very, very concerned about what red lines might be out there that the Russians have set over the last couple of years, now the real risk is what happens if Russia is able to increase their momentum and this whole thing falls apart.
I mean, just operationally, and if Russia is able to put its artillery and its troops on one side of the Russia-Ukraine border and fire at critical infrastructure and civilian targets and military targets from sanctuary, essentially, because Ukraine is limited in its ability to fight back, can Ukraine win that fight? It seems like an impossibility to an amateur like me.
Well, there was some hope in the spring after the Russian attack had been blunted and had been fairly stable for a year and a bit, that Ukraine would be able to develop with the weapons that were coming in and with their training, develop some momentum that would simply push the Russians back to their sanctuary. But your point gets to an even bigger one. How did Russian territory become sacrosanct? How did it become a sanctuary? And there is one simple answer for that, and it's because Russia said it was sacrosanct. And the problem for NATO is that as soon as Russia says something is a red line, NATO has to take that into consideration because the leader may or may not be fully rational, and they were quick to throw around the nuclear weapon trump card that nobody was quite certain they might use. So there's nothing legal about this sanctuary that Russia's talking about. but it has, for the last couple of years, concerned NATO members. And now maybe there are bigger risks that are starting to turn that concern.
I get the argument that who knows what Putin's state of mind is, and of course Russia is a nuclear power, and those are very complicating factors in this. But in sort of the laws of war, we've talked a lot about what's happened with Gaza, that Israel has a right to defend itself in accordance with the laws of war, and as such, you know, there is a tolerance by some countries who are in NATO for what Israel is doing in Gaza and firing into Lebanon and other places like that. How would the laws of war apply to a situation where Ukraine, which was invaded, were to shoot back into Russia? Like, legally it would be allowed? It's more the moral weight of NATO holding them back? How do we interpret that?
That's well put. That's well put, what you just said there. Legally, as long as those targets are valid military targets, Ukraine stands on firm ground.
Right.
So, as I say, the only reason that NATO has put limitations, and Ukraine has followed those limitations for fear of losing those lines of weaponry and even those allies at some point, is because of the concern of these red lines. So no, there is absolutely nothing other than Russian threats that hold Ukraine from moving across their operations across the border into Russia. And we've seen over the last year and a half, in increasing numbers, still very few, attacks on Russian infrastructure, oil depots, things like that, in behind Russian lines that Ukraine really is loath to take responsibility for.
Right. These are like sabotage acts, drone attacks, and things which they sort of use a plausible deniability, so they can't be targeted with it, and may not have used Western-provided or NATO-provided technology. But from a tactical and strategic sense, if Ukraine were to get the green light, because they've struggled with air superiority, obviously in Ukraine, and with air defense because of what's happening, but if they're given permission to start hitting these Russian targets inside Russian territory, what does that do for Ukraine's ability to sort of push back and better protect its civilians and its infrastructure from what Russia has been doing?
It's very important. To your point, you made a couple of minutes ago, when you can only play up to, for instance, in a metaphor, center ice, you're playing defense all the time. You can push the other team back to center ice, but you're not going to score any goals. As soon as you're bringing that weaponry to bear on valid military targets, either a little ways or very deep into Russian territory, it changes that calculus in a big way. And Russian leaders now know that the war is being seen and felt by Russian civilians in their own on their own territory. So it to the Russian side, and probably eases pressure that the Ukrainian soldiers are feeling in around Kharkiv and the Donetsk region.